right. So this first workshop, we're going to introduce what disability is, and it looks like from the chat that most of us here are able-bodied. But yeah, this is a collaboration between Xinsheng Project and Gaokyu Collective. I don't know if I'm saying that wrong, I'm so sorry. So welcome. The opening poll was the question about if you were abled or disabled. And then also let us know what organization you're in. And if anyone wants to share what disability means to them, especially some abled people, I'd love to hear what you think disability is, just to see where we're starting from. And content warnings for uncensored ableist language, primarily sanist language, trauma and mental illness, mentions of medical racism and primarily anti-Blackness, homophobia, and conversion therapy. So while everybody is thinking about what disability means to them, feel free to share it in the chat, or if you'd like to say it aloud, I welcome you to do that also. I want this to be less lecture-y and more like we're all here in community having discussion, which is why it's a teach-in and not a lecture. But I can introduce myself. I am Gigi. They, them pronouns. I work with the Xinsheng Project, primarily doing their English social media, as well as working on a lot of accessibility issues. I identify as politically disabled. We'll get into that a little bit more later. But I have a strong interest in intellectual ableism and language access and linguistic use as somebody who studied linguistics in university. And I also have a strong interest in deaf activism and child language development and deaf culture because I minored in that. I'm both physically and mentally disabled. I'm autistic, and I also have hypermobility Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which we don't need the specifics of, but basically all my joints dislocate pretty easily. Disclaimer, this teaching comes from my own perspective for most of it and my experience within the disability justice world with other activists. And so the personal anecdotes I will be using are primarily mine. I'm going to try not to use too many of them because I feel like there are enough anecdotes out there in the world that everyone can learn from. And being a disabled femme BIPOC, being an intersectional identity also factors a lot into disability justice. And yeah, I'm also a linguist who's like really hyper fixated on language use within the left. So the whole presentation is going to be very biased towards my perspective and my interests and hyperfixations. This presentation, forewarning, is not entirely holistic, and there will be a lot of things I'm missing and should be regarded as a key to understanding disability and ableism and not a full set of all-encompassing information. So I encourage you to ask us questions either in the chat or after the presentation at the end. So, and as well as like doing your own research into it, knowing the things you've learned from today. And also another forewarning, disabled people do not want to be pitied or to be your inspiration porn. So any of the anecdotes, especially my own personal ones, please try not to view it with like a pitying perspective or with a, oh my gosh, you're so inspirational perspective, because it is infantilizing and insulting, to put it very bluntly. And yeah, I think individuality and understanding individual experiences doesn't necessarily help understand the social factors and the systemic oppression of disabled people, which is why this is going to be very much an informational, what is disability directly kind of presentation, instead of talking about my personal experience of what it feels like to be disabled, which you guys will also get a little taste of later. Did anyone want to share about what disability means to them? You can unmute yourself or you can just drop it in the chat. Otherwise, we can move on. Yes, so maybe so.
I'll go ahead. Hi, y'all.
Okay.
I'm Dora. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm actually Gigi's co-host for today. I apologize in advance that my video is off. We just got a flash flood where I'm in Illinois, and I don't have Wi-Fi currently. Disability to me has always existed in how it's been presented in traditional medical discourse. So I am someone who identifies as able-bodied. And I've only begun recently to involve myself in disability justice, and a lot of the information that we're presenting today is pretty fresh for me as well. And so echoing what Gigi has been saying, I'm really glad for all the people who have showed up here, for whom this is a new conversation, and also glad for people for whom this is a very seasoned conversation. And I'm excited to learn with everybody.
Did anyone else want to share? If not, it's okay. Don't feel pressured at all. Okay, you can move on. So to start, I want to share one of the first of the 10 principles of disability justice, which is an emerging framework authored by Sins Invalid. And that's the performance project that celebrates artists with disabilities, that centers artists of color and LGBTQ and gender variant artists. You can read more about them on their website. It's sinsinvalid.org. And we will be touching more on these principles time and time again throughout the workshop series, but I want to start with the first one, which is intersectionality, coined by Audre Lorde. Racial justice and leftist organizations often treat disability justice as an afterthought, especially accessibility. And despite disability having complex intersections with race and class, disability and ableism work to uphold racism, sexism, and classism, especially intellectual ableism, that they justify due to the existence, made up or otherwise, of a mental disability. This problem of intellectual ableism and exclusion of disabled individuals is especially pronounced in the digital and social media-based organizations, which I think a lot of us are part of. Feel free to drop what org you're a part of. I see a lot of Xinjiang people here. Hello, I'm glad you're here with us. And all these issues include my own org, Xinjiang Project. So without the liberation of disabled people or dismantling ableist ideas and frameworks of thinking, racism, sexism, and classism will continue to be upheld and justified because they're all interconnected, and disability is used as kind of like a reasoning behind perpetuating racism and sexism a lot of times. But we'll return to these 10 principles later, but this is the first one that I want you to really keep in mind because I think it's something we forget a lot. So now I want to shift our focus into kind of comparing different modes of understanding and viewing disability in this world. I probably should have switched to this slide, but yeah. So the definition of disability from the traditional medical model of disability, Dora mentioned this earlier, that she understood disability from the traditional medical model primarily. So that, if everyone doesn't know, is kind of defining disability as any impairment of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with a condition to do certain activities, which is called activity limitation, and impairs them from interacting with the world around them, which is participation restrictions. And this is a definition I'm saying pulled directly from CDC. Disabilities can be degenerative and shift over time. Being medically disabled is kind of a fluid identification. You can start off disabled and become not disabled and vice versa. And with degenerative disabilities, they usually worsen with age. So someone who's not yet disabled from a chronic medical condition can or will be later. For example, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I used to be a college athlete, and at some point in life, I'll probably be in a wheelchair. So big range of disability levels there. And there is a second definition that kind of follows the medical definition, but not really. And that's the definition of disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which helps people get like social security benefits and protects them in workplaces, et cetera, et cetera. So the ADA defines a person with a disability as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially, keyword substantially, limits one or more major life activities. So this includes people who have a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. So if you had a history in the past of an impairment, you would still be protected under the ADA. It also includes individuals who do not have a disability, but are regarded as having a disability. So if you have a chronic illness, that is considered a disability, even if you're not disabled and you can move about the world as an abled person, you're still protected under the ADA. So it encompasses like a larger amount of people. And the ADA also makes it unlawful to discriminate against a person based on that person's association with a person with a disability. So if you have a parent with a disability, a workplace can't decide to like not hire you or something. It's a very crude example, but in case anybody needed a clear explanation of that. So these are the two models of disability that most people approach disability from a framework of, because that's the general understanding of what we learned from school is like the person in the wheelchair, the blind person, the person who can't hear. But I want to shift everyone's attention to the social model of disability, which is much more relevant to activist understanding and more progressive understanding of identities. So the social model of disability states that people are disabled by social barriers in society and not by their impairments or their differences. And these barriers can be physical, like buildings not having accessible toilets or ramps, or they can cause by people's attitudes to difference, like assuming disabled people can't do certain things, like assuming that, I'm trying to think of an example, like assuming people who have antisocial personality disorder can't love and are therefore violent. And the social model of disability is based on distinction between the terms impairment and disability. So impairment is used to refer to the actual attributes or lack thereof that affect a person, such as the inability to walk or inability to breathe independently. And the word disability refers to the restrictions caused by society when it doesn't give equal attention and accommodation to the needs of individuals with impairments. So say you can't walk upstairs and they don't provide you a ramp. So a simple example. Imagine that we all live in a society where everybody can fly. There's no stairs and no ladders in this society because everyone can fly, except you can't fly. You and a few other people aren't able to fly, but you maintain the same able-bodied bodies that you have right now. So something to think about. You guys can also say this aloud or reflect in the chat with me. Would that make you disabled? Or are you just simply unable to access certain things in this flying society? Does anybody want to say anything or drop it in the chat? I'll give everyone a moment to think and to reflect. So again, if you are in an all flying society and you are one of the few people who can't fly, but you remain exactly as you are now, are you disabled? So according to the social model, you would be impaired with respect to flying, but given the accommodations that allow you to get to the same location. So for example, everyone just flies to the second floor, but they give you stairs. So you as the one non-flying person can walk up to the second floor. Your impairment would no longer be considered disabling. So that's kind of what the social model of disability addresses, is not the disabilities, but just regarding you as having certain impairments that need accommodations. And society and the structure of society is what makes you disabled, not your actual impairment. Oh, somebody answered. But yeah, exactly. So you would be considered disabled because everyone else has the ability to do something except for you. So then the question is it a disability or an inability? No, not yet. Oh no. How do you go back? How do you go back? Oh my gosh. Wait, sorry guys, technical difficulties. So understanding the social model of disability is important to understanding how disability justice is going to be inherently anti-capitalist, because the system of capitalism wants to make money off of people, and therefore it judges your worthiness in the society and your value to society based on your productivity. And because disabled people under capitalism can't produce at the same rate as abled people, or can only produce things that aren't valued under capitalism and the colonial social models, we disabled people become marginalized and get neglected by the social structures. And when we're neglected, our needs aren't met because our productivity is undervalued. And therefore, capitalism then chooses that it's not worth accommodating us. And that leaves us disabled instead of just having an impairment that could be accommodated for. So here's a discussion question. I'd love to pick 3 people to answer this, and it can be really short. If you're not exactly sure if what you're saying is right or wrong, that's fine. This is just something for everyone to think about and reflect on. Is how do we structure the world around us to be accessible for multiple types of needs? So I can repeat that, and Dora could also, you could please drop that in the chat also. How do we structure the world around us to be accessible for multiple types of needs? And then if anybody wants to unmute and share their thoughts, feel welcome to. If not, you can also drop it in the chat. But I really want to like hear everyone's thoughts, because this isn't a question that has like a black or white, right or wrong answer, because it's something that, you know, shifts based on everyone's accessibility needs, the certain environment you're in like a smaller group setting versus like the world at large. So I'll give it a second and see if anyone wants to unmute.
Oh,
I can take a stab at. Oh, Anna, go first. Sorry.
Oh. So I think that we should like require our like government leaders to learn about disability and all the disability types that there are in the world, and like, because if our leaders don't know about this stuff, like I feel like there's no actual way change can be made. Well, there are some ways we can like help to create some change, but for like actual like buildings and I don't know, like everywhere to be a little bit more accommodated for disabled people. Yeah, I think leaders and people like who are in higher like postures, yeah, should know maybe a little bit more. Yeah.
If somebody has their hand raised, go ahead, DC.
Hello. Well, I think that probably that would have to kind of include like the social, mental, and physical aspects. I mean, I'm missing some things there, but I think to truly address everything, we would also have to have a lot of social change in the ways that like we interact with others and think of things. So I think you've mentioned that too with like language, anti-ableist language, and the way that we think and we approach disability kind of socially. I think that would have to have a lot of change to really address it, and that's one that kind of may get left out more often, aside from the physical aspects of, you know, having more medical accessibility and also just like accessible buildings and physical things like that, so that people can move around more easily.
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone's kind of talking a little bit about like the infrastructure of our society at large, and like community care and looking towards other people for guidance, and not just, you know, relying entirely on ourselves as disabled people, or relying around just a single caretaker, which is kind of an issue right now because caretaker burnout is a huge issue within the disabled community as well. Putting value, yes, and shifting value away from our productivity. So that would require, in a way, definitely would be dismantling capitalism, which only values people who can produce. So that would be like the big overarching goal, is to completely throw out capitalism. So now I think everyone's kind of seeing how disability factors into anti-capitalism. And yes, being proactive about it instead of asking afterwards. I think that's something a lot of disabled people struggle with, is asking to be accommodated, because it's seen as a nuisance, or we're afraid that nobody will try to accommodate us even if we ask. So it would be nice if accommodations are thought of beforehand instead of an afterthought, which a lot of times, especially in online spaces, accessibility is an afterthought. Yes, shifting to socialism. We love that. But yeah. So not everyone identifies with the social model of disability, because even with systemic changes, disability would still exist to some degree in some opinions. Like, if we restructure society, autism would no longer, like, when we're not under capitalism, if we're under socialism, autism would no longer be considered a handicap. It wouldn't be considered a disability, but something like if you are completely paralyzed from and can't function at all without help, you would probably still be disabled. And that's a question of like quality of life, and it gets really complicated from there on forth. But these barriers are often systemic. So disability and ableism, especially intellectual ableism and mental disabilities, are weaponized primarily against BIPOC, femmes, and queers to keep white men in power. So a good example of that would be female hysteria, which used to be categorized in DSM as a insanity issue, like an actual mental health issue, illness, therefore would be a disability, because having this diagnosis, they would say you're not able to make decisions for yourself. So now that female hysteria is taken out of the DSM-5 or whatever the newest edition is lately, then it's no longer categorized as a disability and can't be weaponized against women to keep them from like exposing their husbands for being lying cheaters and bastards or whatever. So stuff like that. And another example would be like, oh, free Britney, I guess. Also, you can see the remnants of the stigma against female hysteria even now today. Like a lot of cis males with cis female exes will be like, oh, she's crazy, and use that as an excuse for their behavior and justifying their actions against people, which you see a lot happening with people who interact with people with mental illnesses, which a lot of them are considered disabilities. So we can address Free Britney a little bit really quickly, but I feel like everybody is very familiar with this case of like her conservatorship and how people are justifying her not needing conservatorship, primarily because like, oh, she's able to do concerts, therefore she can take care of herself, therefore she shouldn't need a conservatorship, when conservatorships shouldn't exist at all. And even if you weren't able-bodied and able-minded, you should still have bodily and like mental autonomy. So conservatorships flat out are inhumane. So anyone using the argument of like, oh, free Britney because she's sane is being ableist and perpetuating ableism. Social model of disability. So the deaf community is a really good example of how the social model of disability works, insofar that being deaf isn't considered a disability if you are fully submerged within the deaf community and deaf society, because they have a completely different structure from our able-bodied society. And so one of the mottos that the deaf community has, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. Oh, excuse me. 1 second. I think I'm good. Okay. So the motto that the deaf community has, that I heard a lot while I was in school with deaf professors, is that deaf people can do anything that hearing people can, except hear. So notice in this title that deaf is capitalized with a capital D instead of a lowercase d. So when you hear deaf spelled with a lowercase d, it's referring to people who are medically, physically deaf. If you see it with a capital D, it's referring to deaf culture and the people who are involved in a culture where people are primarily deaf. So it is politically correct to capitalize the D when speaking about the community itself and not the medical disability. So why they need accommodations is often from a lack of language access, which is language deprivation, which would be normally considered child abuse within the hearing community. And that results from an ableist society not wanting to accommodate them or consider deaf people at all, because it's too much of a nuisance to provide accommodations for deaf people. And deaf people have their own rich culture and community and customs and a different way of understanding and processing the world visually. So how they think about time and how they think about space is completely different from hearing people, because they're visually more advanced. Like they can process visual things a lot better than hearing people can, because science. And deaf people face a lot of systemic barriers, such as not allowing them to use signed languages. So there was a huge convention in the 1800s headed by Alexander Graham Bell, who decided that anybody who used a signed language was, excuse my language, an imbecile and dumb. Anybody who couldn't speak was dumb. Dumb means like a mute person, but it's an insult. It's an ableist insult. So that's kind of where you get like the whole, oh, that's dumb insult from, is saying somebody's stupid because they can't articulate themselves. But it's not fair to force deaf people to be able to speak when they can't hear, because they don't have the feedback, but they can communicate fine in ASL or French Sign Language or British Sign Language or whatever. And so generational trauma has resulted from language deprivation being forced upon deaf people, and assuming that just because they can't speak, they're dumb, imbeciles, and stupid. And a good case example of where deafness wasn't considered a disability and was actually the norm was in Martha's Vineyard. So in Martha's Vineyard in the mid-19th century, one in every 25 people in Chilmark, which is like a small town in Martha's Vineyard, was deaf. In the US by overall, in contrast, it was like 1 out of 5,700 people. And everybody signed in this community, including the hearing people, because enough of the population was deaf. And therefore it was just easier to teach the hearing people to sign and communicate that way than to force the deaf people to be able to hear and speak, which is actually an issue in audiology, as a lot of audiologists will tell deaf people, just try harder to hear. And you couldn't tell if somebody was deaf or hearing because of the linguistic culture of this specific deaf community, because everybody was signing. So walking into the community, you rarely ever heard people speak in public. The default language, the lingua franca, was to sign, and Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. But, you know, after that huge convention thing, signing was considered not a language anymore linguistically, and it's only recently, within like the 60s, has been considered a full-blown language instead of just pictograms or whatever. And so Martha's Vineyard Sign Language has actually died out because that community was forced into residential schools for the deaf and dumb to force them to learn how to speak. And if you couldn't speak, you were considered dumb, which is why, you know, I might get on your asses if you use dumb as an insult. So here's something to consider, and maybe some of you will be willing to share, is imagine being thrown into the deaf community with no ability to sign or communicate. Everyone else is deaf except for you. And you can speak to communicate, but they can't hear you, and everyone can sign, but you don't understand sign. So would you be able to function in this society if you were deprived of language? And would that make you disabled? So this is similar to the flying question, except now it is like a very real situation. Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself if you feel compelled. Or you can share in the chat. You don't have to speak aloud. Give it a minute. No, okay. So you wouldn't have been considered disabled in this community if you just learned to sign, even though you're the odd one out for being hearing. and you're allowed to learn the language and things are made accessible for you, you have the ability to communicate with other people. And that's something that unfortunately a lot of deaf people don't have even today in the hearing world. Is, you know, you kind of, when hearing people see a deaf person who can speak, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, wow, you're so amazing for learning how to speak, when it's just another skill and you're not any less valuable or more or less of a person if you can't speak as a deaf person. But unfortunately, within the academic system and within the world at large, if you are deaf and you can't speak, you're considered lesser and valued less. So the next thing I want to address is being descriptively disabled versus being politically disabled. And some of you who were here for my own intro might remember that I described myself as politically disabled. So being descriptively disabled means that you live the disabled experience of being systemically mistreated, being ostracized because of your disabilities, being institutionalized, being stared at, being isolated, being shunned, et cetera, et cetera. But being politically disabled, you are descriptively disabled and you are also having a political and social understanding of ableism, power, privileged, and intersectional identity politics of that lived experience, as well as feeling a connection to the rest of the politically disabled community and having solidarity with other disabled people because of this intersectional, complex, nuanced understanding of how disability and ableism functions in society. And BIPOC disabled people are a lot more likely to be politically disabled than descriptively disabled people. And this has been a whole conversation on Twitter lately of how, you know, disability and ableism are weaponized against us BIPOC disabled people, especially Black disabled people. And it's just because, like, white disabled people, you're still white. You're white before everything else. And you will still be able to gain accommodations and access more easily than somebody who's disabled and just Black, or, you know, all these intersectional identities coming into play. If you are white and you're a man and you're disabled, you're far more well off than like a queer Black woman who is disabled. And so here's another discussion question is, for those of you who are disabled, have you thought about your disability as a political identity, or have you like factored it into your politics at all? And that's just, I remember in the beginning when I asked everybody if they were disabled or abled, I only saw like 1 or 2 people say they were disabled. And most of you said you were able-bodied and able-minded. But I think everyone kind of knows that I'm politically disabled as I've been speaking about it. But if you are disabled, if you want to share about if you identify as politically disabled or not, like, feel free. I don't just want this presentation to be all my anecdotes or my anecdotes from working within the deaf community. Cool. You don't have to share, so nobody feel pressured to do so. Oh, somebody wrote a message. Yeah, it is from Mia. Oh my God, Maya. Maya. Yeah. Yeah, disability is definitely a political identity. I think a lot of people don't view it as a political identity because of the medical model and because it is tied to like social norms and like pro-capitalism. And capitalism makes disability and creates disability instead of allowing impairments to be accommodated for. But moving on. So disability is the only marginalized identity that anyone can move into at any time in their life. If you get older, if you live long enough to get old, you will at some point become disabled because the world just isn't made for aging or aging people because they don't produce anymore. So, you know, disability can also be really temporary. Like if you have a broken arm, you're protected under the ADA and you would be disabled because you have one less arm to use at that point if it's in a cast. Or it can be permanent. like getting into a car accident and being paralyzed. These are just like very crude physical examples because a lot of you are able-bodied here. And I think, you know, these physical examples are a little easier for people to understand, especially, you know, you see tropes like that in media a lot. But just because you're descriptively disabled doesn't necessarily mean you're politically disabled. And most people who are descriptively disabled temporarily never become politically disabled. So like somebody who got a broken arm, they're disabled in that like 2-month period, but they will never move into political disability because disability politics might not affect them directly further from that point of having a broken arm. But we've talked a lot about like physical disabilities, mental disabilities. I just kind of want to define that for everybody. So physical disability is, as its name states, impairment due to the conditions of the body, which can include deafness, blindness, needing a wheelchair, you know, things we see as like disabled representation in the media or whatever. And it also includes things like chronic pain or invisible illnesses that are physical, like Hashimoto's or something, or Crohn's, IBS, HEDS, which is what I have, chronic migraines. Some of you might not consider those disabilities, but they do affect your quality of life. So some physical disabilities do not have to be or feel like a disability under certain social conditions. Like, you know, being deaf and living in a deaf community, everyone else is deaf too, so you don't feel like you're disabled. And so learning more about what a physical disability could be, just want to ask any of you who identify as able-bodied, at what point in life have you been or will you be physically disabled now that you kind of know what is constituting a physical disability? So like a broken arm or like a twisted ankle, or you're temporarily in a wheelchair. Have you ever at one point been physically disabled, even if you identify as able-bodied now? I remember somebody in the chat said they used to identify as disabled and now no longer do. And if you feel comfortable sharing, please share, because that's like a really interesting perspective. But also don't feel pressure to share.
Hi, this is Derek speaking. That was me that said I was. So yeah, like I said, I did identify because I had a panic disorder that actually prevented me from doing literally anything. Like it made it hard to even walk down to the first floor of my building when I was living up on the 4th floor at times, because I would just have these severe panic attacks and I would just like crumble to the floor in a fetal position from it. But I mean, also as far as physical disabilities, like I'm a type 2 diabetic. So eventually, like I already like am doing a little worse for the wear after being fairly solitary for like a year and a half in lockdown and during the pandemic. So like I feel like ultimately also knowing my dad's history with type 2, that like it's something is going to happen to my body that I will succumb to as a result of like my diabetes through complications with it at some point.
TT said, related to this point, the term body-mind was coined to bridge the separation between physical and mental. Body-mind is approached to understand the relationship between the human body and mind, where they are seen as a single integrated unit. Yeah, so that is also kind of another thing that we will address later, is how physical and mental disabilities are often tied together. And so what constitutes a mental disability is impairment due to the conditions of the mind, which can include psychosis, psychotic disorders, autism, depression, PTSD, and the mind-body thing is here, brain fog resulting from chronic pain. So you can see here how the mind and the body are not two separate entities, and your body can't overcome your mind and your mind can't overcome your body because they are one and the same. And anything that happens to one will affect the other. And I think a lot of the issues with understanding disability is people assume that it is one or the other, or that being disabled, if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. And therefore it has to be like a physical thing. And if it is a mental thing, it has to be very physically viewable. Oh, yes, there's an org. People apply. Yes, thank you for coming. But yeah, another thing that could be considered a mental disability that like not a lot of people think of is neurodivergence, which is differing in mental function from the norm. So like anybody with like a mental illness, such as like a chronic anxiety disorder or a panic disorder, psychosis, that it affects you from like viewing the world in a able-minded way would be considered neurodivergence. And neurodivergent people can still be allistic. So anyone who's allistic is just not autistic. So you can have ADHD and be neurodivergent, but that still makes you allistic because you're not autistic. But then again, stuff like ADHD and autism go hand in hand. So again, mental disabilities and physical disabilities can both affect you at any point in life. Like you can all of a sudden suffer a mental trauma and become mentally disabled because you develop severe PTSD or something. So a lot of times I think people have this disconnect from like, oh, it'll never happen to me, because they think of like congenital disorders that you're born with. But again, disability can affect you and probably will affect you at some point in life. So here's something for everyone to think about as people who are in the activist leftist community is, are you neurodivergent, and have you considered needing accessibility instead of forcing yourself to do things the way holistic society forces you to do so? And how are organizations structured that make them not very accessible for those with mental disabilities and neurodivergence? And this is a question we will be revisiting in the third workshop when we start evaluating our own organizations. And so like, feel free to drop your answers in. And then also, this is something to reflect on in the next couple of weeks if you want to come to the third workshop and kind of figure out how your organizational structure can be more friendly to neurodivergent people. Did anyone want to share? Feel free. If not, we can move on. I think we're good to go.
Gigi, I know we have a lot of content here, but do you think we could jump ahead to the section on disability specifically and political activism and then loop back to where we are now?
Good idea. Okay. So disability and political activism, we just skipped ahead a couple slides. So many of us may be neurodivergent and not know it. And neurodivergence and autistics are drawn to politics and theory because of the logical way we think, which is kind of a stereotype. It is also kind of true in some people, especially like how things work. Thus, like politics become a hyperfixation for a lot of people with ADHD and autism. Because a lot of you might actually have ADHD or be autistic and not know it, but also don't self-diagnose. Like, try to seek a professional if you can. If you can't, then like do your research before you try to self-diagnose. So something that's common in ND people is info dumping, which is like sharing a lot of information all at once about a topic of interest, whatever like the topic of interest in the moment in the conversation is. Kind of like now I'm info dumping about disability. And it's a way to show that you care about a topic and you care about people. So you're info dumping to somebody because you think that the topic at hand affects them and is something that will help them or be interesting to them. So it is kind of a love language. And even though it's a very logical explanation and delivering of information, it is a show of emotion. So a lot of people view info dumping as a good thing because it's like, oh, you can learn from the person. They're constantly learning and constantly regurgitating information, and then fall into this cycle of just relying on them for information all the time, when it's actually very, very mentally and emotionally draining at times, which can lead to burnout. So a lot of our emotional burnout can be attributed to sensory overload from like, you know, getting all the bad news all the time and like absorbing too much information all at once and trying to do everything all at once because we're hyperfixated on the topic and because we care so much and we want to show care by like info dumping and teaching people. So it's seen a lot in ADHD and autism. I think it's something that activists struggle with a lot is burnout, which makes the movement less sustainable. And it's also something that happens more easily to people who have depression, anxiety, and CPTSD. And like not giving people enough mental and emotional breaks can also cause burnout. So that's something you have to think about when you are organizing is to give those breaks. And a little example of like ableism is like telling people to touch grass or go outside or take a walk or whatever, because you kind of imply that you're not doing good work unless you are doing groundwork. And there's a lot of disabled people who literally cannot step foot outside and do that groundwork. So to assume that everybody is if you're only valid if you go outside and do the groundwork is really ableist, because online activism may be the only accessible form of activism for a lot of people. So that's even more important to include accessibility in our political activism online, in the online spaces, because so many people involved in online activism are disabled, and this is the only way they can engage. So now that everybody kind of like has a better understanding of disability and how it functions under capitalism and the taste of ableism, I want to share with you the 10 principles of disability justice that we talked about in intersectionality before, but I will touch on the rest. The second would be the leadership of those most impacted. So the leadership of those most impacted would be kind of what you mentioned before, like listening to disabled voices about what they need instead of speaking for them, which is an issue in the disabled community. I think it's also an issue in a lot of other communities, but because of like the infantilization and assumption that disabled people can't think for themselves, it affects us a lot more, especially if you have intersectional identities. And anti-capitalism, because again, capitalism makes us disabled instead of just being impaired. And cross-movement solidarity, again, it's an intersectional thing, so we should be advocating for all different types of disabilities because they're all interconnected. 5 is wholeness. So somebody who's disabled is not an able person minus an ability to function. It's just a person who then also happens to be impaired a certain way and needs certain amount of access. 6, sustainability. It shouldn't be something that people touch on really quick and move on from or dies out because people don't care about it. And again, burnout is a huge issue. So, in activism and disability justice, you have to make sure what you're doing is sustainable and prevent burnout, which takes a lot of like mental health into account. Cross disability solidarity, again, addressing that all disabilities are connected and therefore advocating for one disability, you must advocate for another. 8 would be interdependence. So we meet each other's needs as we build towards liberation, knowing that state solutions will only further oppress and cause a lot more issues and extend further control into our lives. So I know a lot of people said talking to like the government and getting our leaders to do something, it's like working with this in the system. Voting can only change so much. 9 is collective access. So Black, brown, and queer-bodied disabled people bring flexibility and creative nuance that go beyond a white, able-bodied or able-minded normativity. So then we have to build a community outside of the norm. And collective liberation. So no body or mind can be left behind. Notice we also mention mind a lot in disability justice because again, body and mind are the same, they're connected. And we have to think outside of the Western dichotomy of the mind being separate from the body. So now that everyone's kind of learned about disability justice and being disabled, I want to pose to everyone, how do you identify now? Do you identify differently from when we asked this question in the beginning? So if you had answered disabled, are you descriptively disabled or are you politically disabled? And if you answered abled, does this presentation change your mind into thinking, oh, maybe I am disabled? I just never thought of it as a disability.
And I'd welcome people to really just sit with Gigi's question there and sit with the definitions that I've come across today, especially for people for who this might be new. The realizations and the learning, I think, goes on for a long time. And we will be sending out our script and slides to the attendees that we have taken attendance for after I add image descriptions to our slides, and then we clean up our script for a bit more legibility. This way, for any of you who want to, revisit some definitions, maybe click some hyperlinks, you'll have that available to you as well.
Oh, bye, Amy. Thank you for coming. Yeah, if anybody had like a change or a realization in their identity, if you feel like sharing, I'd love to hear that, because a couple of people in my lives, as I like talk about disability justice, have this epiphany moment where they're like, oh, maybe I am disabled. I'm just trying too hard within a capitalist society because I think I must function in this able-bodied way. And this is usually for people who are like neurodivergent. Yeah, I think bipolar is considered a neurodivergence as well. And so is like general anxiety disorder, not like the feeling of anxiety itself, but like the actual disorder. Nobody really changed their mind about how they identify. I want to ask the abled people now. So if some abled people can speak up, is how will you approach disability as an identity, as like an able-bodied person? Like, what does advocating for disability justice mean to you and your organization now? So I want you to think outside of just yourself and how you incorporate disability justice in your lives. But how does this impact your organizing specifically? So if anybody here is part of an org, or even if you want to like privately chat with some people in your org to come up with an answer, feel free to do so. Because now we're reaching the end and I kind of want everyone to just reflect. And you don't have to answer any of these specific questions, but if there's anything you learned outside of just these questions I'm posing for you to think about, feel free to share that as well. I'll mute myself so you guys can have the floor.
Something that you could possibly do is like keep options for organizing online, even like after COVID, when people start moving back more into like in-person activities, just like having that online option available to make it like more accessible to everyone.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot more people became more like politically involved because organizing online became normalized over the pandemic, is because this was the only way a lot of people could engage. And I think a lot of orgs have popped up around that time because, you know, that was the only way you could get involved in organizing. So I think it will continue that most organizing or all the online orgs will continue being online and not have to require people doing groundwork. But it's also the other way also happens where like a lot of people who can only do groundwork aren't able to because of the pandemic. And yeah, asking everyone's access needs would be good. I think, again, that's being proactive in including people and addressing accessibility. I think we have some slides about what like accessibility is. I don't think we've addressed that specifically, but like accessibility is the quality of being easily understood, reached, entered, obtained, and appreciated, which includes things like crutches, closed captioning, extra time off if you need so to avoid burnout, flexibility of deadlines, ramps, etc. And accessibility that we don't really think of as being like accessibility accommodation things are straws, which were developed for people in hospitals so they wouldn't spill water on themselves. Stairs, elevators, and escalators. Able-bodied people use them, so we don't think of them as accommodations necessarily. Glasses and contact lenses, because it's so normalized and widespread. Cars, you know, public transportation is actually really hard to access for people, so cars are actually a mode of accommodations. Chairs, some people with chronic fatigue have to sit down, but we don't think of chairs as accommodations because we all use them. I'm pretty sure most of us are using them right now. Spoken language interpreters, language interpreters, because spoken languages are considered like, oh, if you go to an event, there's going to be like a language interpreter. But for signed languages, it's not considered a priority because like, oh, they can just read lips when, you know, not everyone can read lips. And even if you can, you're only right about 57% of the time or something like that. Yeah, I think that's it for the presentation. I have a couple more examples, but I think everyone gets the gist of it. If you do want to hang out and kind of talk and ask questions, feel free to do so. If not, we will be sending out a Google form to ask everybody what they want to learn for the next workshops. And yeah, thank you for coming. Donations for labor. Gaokyu Collective has a mutual aid fund. That's a coffee link that will be linked in the slideshow when we send it to you. And the Xinjiang project also has a buy me a coffee link that goes directly to the project to like maintain your website and stuff. So yeah, I'll just chill here for a bit and see if anyone wants to hang and talk and chill. If not, we'll see you all next week. Thank you for like coming and caring for all the people who are abled. It really means a lot.